The golden age of America begins right now.
In 2024, Trump won the United States election on both the popular vote and the Electoral College. It comes as a surprise and hope for some, horror for others. During the whole electoral season, we can clearly see the divide on cultural issues between the two different factions. On one hand, there is Republican representing the force of cultural conservatism and isolationism, where on the other hand, there is Democrats representing a wide range of cultural ideologies, from liberalism to progressivism to anything that is remotely incompatible with mainstream conservatism. Well, traditionally, most individuals that belongs to minority groups of protected characteristics often vote for Democratic Party and vouch for left-leaning candidates and policies. In the aftermath of the election, it has shown that across most demographic groups, there is a significant swing towards Trump, including almost a double amount of voter share in young black males and a 3% increase in voter share in female voters across the country. This is not a complete shock if you have been terminally online like I do. In many social media platforms, there are many individuals who identify themselves as a part of a minority groups, but seemingly going against the mainstream opinions of their own community. Many of the content creators of this kind, often called grifters, are despised by their own community. They curate their content in line with the conservative talking points, including vouching for anti-trans legislations by many gay men and women, anti-immigration policies by individuals of immigrant descent, and so on. It is hard to deny the fact that some of them saw a monetary opportunity for themselves, that they are willing to say controversial opinions to stir up views and create rage baits to drive up engagement factors. However, it is undeniable that for some other individuals, they genuinely believe what they say and they feel the need to express their own opinions despite knowing the potential for backlash coming from some of the others that are closest to their own. The question that naturally arises is why? Why would an individual commit to seemingly irrational thoughts and actions against potentially their own interest? How did the conservatives convince them that what they believe is correct when most others in the same community believes otherwise? How is their morality constructed through various influences that made them end up holding these kinds of views? Why did they dance with the leopards even though they know the leopards want them to die? During the late 19th century, universal suffrage movement is still in its infancy. By the time, in most even so-called democratic countries, voting rights are still a privilege reserved for white men only. The idea that women can vote is, for most individuals, a highly contested issue within society. Hence, it is unsurprising that the universal suffrage movement received as much opposition as possible in the next 50 years, in line with any progressive social movement's trajectory. It is easy to imagine that the movement's opposition is purely consist of men that felt threatened that their position of privilege is being challenged. While it is true that many men that went against the movement, a significant portion of the anti-suffrage movement were consistent of women. And not only women who are within traditional conservative household, but also many prominent rising figures in their careers and those who might be typically considered role models for other aspiring career women, including important historical figures like Ida Tarbell, who did change her opinion afterwards but was a big proponent of the anti-suffrage movement, who by all accounts is very progressive in many other regards for being an impressive investigative journalist exposing the big oil industry in the early 20th century. At the peak, the National Association opposed to women's suffrage, an all-woman organization dedicated towards not allowing themselves to vote, have over 500,000 members across America. It is not hard to see the parallel between the language and justification of women supporting anti-suffrage movement more than 100 years ago and many minority supporters of conservatives now. One of the main reasons supporters of anti-suffrage movement, quoted by journalists and historian, is that they believe women have already had enough rights. and having further rights would result in a world where they would either have to have too much privilege and be corrupted by politics, or they would have to lose some of the existing privilege within the family. As a comparison, one of the most common sentiments pushed forward by the log-cabin Republican, a right-wing Trump-supporting queer advocacy group, is that they believe that queer people are people first and should not have privileges more than their fellow citizens. Anti-suffrage movement created tangible threat as a counter-movement towards the suffragists. At the height of the anti-suffrage movement in the UK, the anti-suffrage publication Anti-Suffrage Review boasted more than 42,000 subscribing members and 15,000 public adherents, and was heavily propagated to influence male politicians to prevent women from voting. This is especially in contrast with many suffragists' militant tactics, inciting violence through often illegal activities such as window-breaking raids. The anti-suffrage movement seemed to be the more sensible choice amongst many people in the public. Luckily, they did not end up being successful, as in most modern democratic countries enshrined women's rights to vote into their own constitution. In the aftermath of the situation, some of the anti-suffragists, including Ida Tarbell, argues that she was misdirected and have turned her mind into supporting the cause now, while some other anti-suffragists stayed away from the politics as a whole true to their principles, and others moved on to other political endeavors such as supporting the Republican Party. The right to vote for women is so entrenched within our fundamental democratic value now that even the hardcore conservatives would hesitate to challenge the notion, at least not directly and publicly through words without mockery. However, it is weird to think that only 5 generations ago, the world was so different in their outlook on such a fundamental belief we have right now, even for those who, in hindsight, benefited from the social change and progress. The anti-suffrage movement is not the only movement that was established by certain groups of individuals seemingly against the progression of their own rights. Many anti-colonialist movements from places such as India and Nigeria faced fierce opposition from people of their own kind, including the British Raj and the Warren chiefs, who were very active in exercising the power of control in the name of colonizers, rather than supporting people that share the same lineage, language, and appearance with them. It is important to point out here that even though number-wise individuals that were appearing to be going against their own interests are by no means frivolous and do constitute a major force in many of the counter-movements across history, they are still minorities within minority communities percentage-wise. No matter how much Kanye West wants to claim that slavery is a choice, he cannot represent the opinions of most black people in America and erase their efforts in participating in a lot of the political discourse voicing out their opposition against structural racism and so on. Nonetheless, the question lingers. Why do many individuals deliberately choose to go against their own community, even at the risk of being exercised? Currently, there is a prevalent joke on social media that whenever a large Republican gathering occurs in the United States, Grindr, the gay hookup application, experiences a significant increase in traffic, often leading to public outrage. There is obviously a cognitive dissonance about the situation, with speakers in the event obviously citing the need to eliminate queer individuals from history and treat transgendered individuals as the root cause of the society's problems. It is hard to imagine people that actively participate in acts of queerness, especially using Grindr, the ultimate symbol of gay culture, are also actively supporting their rights of even using Grindr to be taken away. Many scholars attribute these kinds of behaviors as internalized homophobia, that there is an internal battle between their identities as queer individuals and their beliefs. It framed most individuals who support Trump that also engage in homophobic acts as individuals who desperate to be accepted and respected by a dominant social majority, against their own conception where acts of queerness is shameful. This is particularly prevalent when the individual is also white, middle class, and occupies some position of privilege in a society. That their desire to continue occupy their privilege leads them to uphold a heteronormative ideal and subsequently resist the more radical ideals and change that are called for by working class, non-white individuals within the queer community. The reasoning has some merits. It is undeniable that individuals are engraved in the culture they grew up in, and the desire to be normal within the context you live in is strong. In a way, they suppress their own desires to perform a version of themselves that they deem to be ideal, leading to somewhat frenzied acts of chanting homophobic slurs and rhetoric to justify their own position within society, as they are afraid that if they do not, they will be called out and questioned about their own privileges. Nonetheless, to blame it all on internalized homophobia or the desire to perform as the ideal citizen within the heteronormative society is also inaccurate. Most of all, if you have listened to any Trump supporter, it is easy to deduce that most of them do not believe they are socially accepted. In fact, many of the Trump supporters believe they are in risk of being ostracized by the mainstream majority and getting cancelled. And they're proud to be an outcast of the society as a whole, for speaking out against established hierarchies where they're oppressed through denying their freedom of speech. Secondly, there are many individuals who publicly support Trump, also are publicly outed, and actively contribute to the narrative that Republicans are the party that cares about the queer community, whereas even Democratic allies such as Obama gets publicly shamed for calling out Trump and his homophobic policies. Lastly, it does not explain other forms of minority Trump supporters whose attributes are harder to hide, especially the rise of it, such as being a person of color or those who require medical attentions. It is important for us to take a step back and look at the big picture. In contemporary political and sociological discussions, we tend to discuss different characterizations in isolation. For example, when you read a research paper about the livelihood of Black individuals, authors are discussing the impact of Blackness, and often Blackness only, on people's lives. When you examine these statistics, it is hard to have a large enough sample size that allows you to filter through the statistics through multiple characteristics and still yield meaningful results. When you see the news, the wordings are often chosen to highlight a few specific characteristics rather than providing detailed information about certain groups of individuals. These are not critiques on modern political discussions. In fact, no matter how much we emphasize intersectionality exists, it is the nature of discourse that some nuances must be lost to create a common understanding. However, when characterizing individuals who seemingly act against their own interest, we must not forget that multiple identities that are interwoven and sometimes in tension with each other are in play. Let's examine more closely the language we often deploy. We often refer to the person who is gay and voting for the Republican Party in the US as a gay Republican. The gayness as a characteristic is at the forefront of how people perceive such a person and becomes an adjective to the Republican identity as a noun, which reflects the core of the identity of the individuals. This is in line with how many of them feel about their existence. When gay Republicans are interviewed, they often understand the inherent tension between the two different identities at play. However, unlike many of us who feel as though queerness or gayness inherently plays into the type of politics we adopt and advocacy we do, most of them feels their queerness comes second to their support of Republican ideals, including lower taxes, stronger border control, and rights to private properties. Their actions of queerness are to some mostly just actions with no intention of forming communities based off these actions alone, and to others they prioritize compared to the voting issues they deem are more important. Additionally, while there is a certain level of concern that they would be ostracized socially in both queer spaces and Republican platforms, people seem to have a harder time assimilating amongst queer peers than Republicans. Some detail their experience of facing significant backlash from social spaces and queer spaces, such as receiving threats in gay bars and online forums, while in Republican spaces, there seems to be a consensus of queerness being a non-issue and even warm welcomes. One person particularly notes that most of their fellow Republican peers do not reflect the policies that the Republicans seem to be pushing, which made them feel the assurance that they would not be harmed. This also explains why a significant number of gay Republicans are often white cis male that are brought up in conservative religious upbringings, where the gay identity often develops at a much later stage compared to other identities that are more prevalent in culture, meaning that people often feel a closer affiliation as a result. This is particularly visible in individuals who grew up in rural areas where they often feel like a cultural disconnect from the mainstream queer culture that is associated with urban landscape that are commercial and predatory. Of course, for many of them, their exact political leanings are also more nuanced than the simple label of Republican. For many of them, gay rights are still an important voting issue, and many of them felt that Republican has been losing them over the years in terms of protecting their own rights, visible by the 22% share swing away from the Trump presidency campaign in 2020, which makes it one of the few voting demographics where Democrats significantly gained favor from. Nonetheless, this does not stop that around 12% of them still voted for Republican and often loudly and proudly declared their stance on the social media. Beyond queer identities and the specific context of the United States, there are many similar instances of minorities pandering to the conservative majorities occurring around the world. From the rise of traditional wife against modern feminism on social media, to the rise of working class voting for the Reform Party in the UK, all have demonstrated a considerable effect on the political landscape of the society today. In many of the instances, these voices become louder than those of traditional conservative groups because of their inherent tensions between their identities and are automatically controversial as a result. To look further into the validity of the tactic, we must examine further. Do the tactic of giving up minority parts of your identity in favor of a majority one ever works? Are people satisfied or feel protected when they gave up their underprivileged identity over a privileged one? It's hard to say whether people are satisfied about something, especially as someone outside of that same group. For some people, sacrificing parts of themselves in exchange for safety does work. For example, if you're someone who lives in a society where being openly gay means you could be stoned to death, it is very reasonable to not out yourself publicly. Similarly, if you're the only person of color in a very conservative community, perhaps it is okay or even moral to try to strive to assimilate with the mainstream narrative and actively denounce your previous peers to just keep yourself safe at night. But the current situation is a bit more complicated. For many of the people who are trying to assimilate to the mainstream communities are often instead the more privileged ones. People who are ultimately practicing or participating within the huge propaganda machines as the model minorities often are seen as minorities first rather than their hidden allegiance with the majoritarian groups. In many instances, they do not represent the average individuals that live in society. For example, Nicki Minaj, who has recently got into controversies for turning into a fervent Trump supporter, got into Turning Point USA, is hardly an average representation of black people living in America. Similarly, Sam Altman, the openly gay OpenAI CEO, who has pledged $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund and one of the richest people in the world, is also hardly a representation of average queer individuals inside our world. This is not to say that everyone who are trying to assimilate are as privileged as them, but it is true that many of them make actions that are detached or even at times in contradiction to their own cultural identity because they can afford to do so. They do not rely on people who share similar characteristics as them to build chosen families in order to survive, nor do they rely on publicly funded programs and support to advance their own positionings. From a completely utilitarian perspective, the individuals who chose to yearn for the approval of the privilege must mean that they benefit from the approval more than they can receive from their own community. Nonetheless, beyond simply the lack of need to participate in a community, there is often perceived benefit comes from being an active criticizer of said community. Through denouncing their underprivileged and savaged peers, they have attempted to shift the narrative of us versus them by depicting themselves as the more civilized and righteous us, with people who are privileged against others who have the same characteristics as savage others. The goal is to integrate themselves within the hierarchy further by delineating people they used to associate, so they hopefully are seen either still as privileged one or become the privileged one. As an example, the recently infamous straight acting Brotherhood Online, who claimed to aim to provide social spaces for masculine men that are into men and against hollow gay culture, LGBT, and rainbow flags, has made incredibly clear that sexuality for them comes in second place to their gender identity, as traditional masculinity is something ought to be celebrated, while the conventional gayness is to be frowned upon. The sentimental shift of privileged us versus a savage them within the minority group is deliberate. It is deliberate tactic used by the privileged, consciously or sometimes unconsciously, to divide up the community. In the anti-suffrage movement previously mentioned, it is heavily invested by the imperialists who are worried that women's suffrage would grant instability in the British colonies, particularly in areas such as India and Egypt. One of the main key figures of the anti-suffrage movement, Gertrude Bell, was funded by her wealthy family, who gave her immense power in the government, even holding offices such as Secretary of Iraq, to grant legitimacy to the movement and prevent the legislation of women's suffrage from being passed. Given the influence of social media and algorithms, it is surprising that many people are susceptible to ideologies promoted by online bots, which they then internalize as their own. Social media platforms such as TikTok and Twitter are increasingly being used as people's primary site of information, and that often shape people's conception of reality and indoctrinates people within the ideology they believe. X, since Elon Musk's purchase of the company, has been algorithmically prioritizing content that is fit for the right-wing narrative towards accounts that are considered neutral, resulting in many people being further radicalized, even those that belong to minority groups. In addition, groups such as the LGB alliances, which are sponsored by right-wing organizations, were pushed towards the forefront of the social media, deliberately aim to sow division amongst the existing social movements. However, people often overestimate the amount of power they have in terms of shifting cultural dialogue themselves. For many people trying to pander to the conservative right, especially for those who identify themselves as the privileged but lacks relevant social political capital to cash in such privilege, the situation often backfires in the end. The most prominent example perhaps is the previous Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who at one point was considered the face of the MAGA movement, while branding herself as one of the Trump's biggest allies. However, the instance Marjorie delineates from the conservative establishment on the issue of Epstein, she was quickly attacked by Trump as well as the majority of the MAGA movement, who used to praise her as one of their best freedom fighters. This has resulted in her receiving a huge amount of threats and ultimately cost her the Congress seat and her political career for now. Marjorie Taylor Greene is far from the only person within the far-right landscape who have been betrayed. Particularly many modern TikTok far-right influencers falls into this category, as their success is highly limited to their sphere of influence, while many of them never were allowed in the traditional conservative platforms to further their privilege either. From MAGA mothers crying over grocery prices and the cut of SNAP benefits to immigrants who supported Trump but then detained by ICE, many of these people not only participate in the act of grifting, but also share the genuine belief that they are different than other people that are on SNAP or immigrants that are lazy and live on welfare. In addition, the yearn for approval from the privileged not only does not work in terms of gaining support and approval in the long term, but also often creates significant amount of backlash across existing supporters. In celebrity spaces, Nicki Minaj has now lost more than 3 million followers on Instagram since becoming one of the faces of MAGA, and was heavily criticized by many fellow black artists and queer fans. Even from a personal level, it has shown that people are less willing to support people who shows existing right-wing tendencies, citing reasons including not being able to feel emotionally safe or as a precaution method to protect other people around them. In an increasingly stressful and polarizing world, there is an ever-increasing need for us to band together to survive. However, precisely in these times, our similarities have often been diminished while our differences, even amongst the so-called tight-knit communities, are enhanced through our experiences. How then we as a collective can move on from chasing privileges, even when sometimes it feels like necessary to survive? I must be honest, in addition to being extremely busy with my personal and professional life, there is another reason for this script takes so long to write. For a long time, I have struggled to think of a suitable antidote to conclude the script, and I feel frustrated by the sense of helplessness and the inability to provide guidance after merely observing the problems. I also do not particularly like the language used in script. Words like privileged and majority feel odd to use, yet I cannot find better descriptors to relay my thoughts clearly and precisely. It feels like I am feeding into the grand narrative that some characteristics of humans are designed to be more important in society, even if it's just under the status quo. In a weird way, the language that I am directly using fuels the sentiment that our survival must be discussed through the lens of the privileged and henceforth victimize myself and the communities I am discussing. If we believe that we were in some form or way inherently in a worse position than those we deem to be more privileged, it is not hard to see why people would want to disassociate with that position in the first place. The community of the minority or the underprivileged is, however, not inherently weaker ones. If anything, many of these communities, including the Black, the queer, and the immigrant communities, and so many so on, exhibits great strength in modern day society against the structural oppression they face. The modern day society would not be the same if not for the support these communities have for their members and how much resilience they show against the backlashes from people in positions of power. There is a legitimate claim to victimhood for many of these communities. Structural violence is still rampant in our society, and with the growing tensions and political polarizations that exist in our world, there are bound to be people that are actual victims of actual violence in the world. There's no diminishing the harms that have come our way and will come our way. But if we let the sense of victimhood consume us all, we become defenseless and helpless. We become the damsel in distress in the society, and we play into the role which other people want us to be, as people who need other people's grace in order to survive. And essentially that's what many of the people who support the privilege feel like they are, that they were severely hurt for their complex identities and wishing for someone in a higher societal hierarchy would save them and accept them, when most of them probably even knew that deep down it's likely never going to happen. Furthermore, victimization of oneself inherently lends itself to hate politics, which inherently lends itself to the cycle of violence that the far-right extremism wishes to perpetuate. Nazism would not be possible without the sense of earned right, that nobody but them understand your hurt and can enact revenge on your behalf. They want you to believe that the power only lies in climbing up the existing hierarchy, and the only way to prevent further harm is to engage in identity politics that reduce people down to simple generalizations rather than treating everyone as people with complex characteristics. To move away from seeing the world as black and white and putting ourselves in the position of helplessness, we must dismantle our own sense of privilege and hierarchy. We must realize that the leopards are fightable, and the only way to survive is not to hope it do not eat your face off and feed it to other people, rather than struggling through it and triumph. Deconstructing our own sense of privilege and sense of social hierarchy is obviously a very tough job to do. Especially when done uncritically and unthoughtfully, it may lead to another dark hole filled with conspiracy theory instead. There is no universal guidance on how to deconstruct the world, especially given the increasing complexity of life that we are facing today. However, that does not mean that the process of dismantling the sense of privilege and hierarchy must be a lonely road without guidance. For example, it always involves questioning yourself, challenging your own existing intuitions, dissecting your own emotions, and establish your own principles. Then it also includes finding your communities that accept you and willing to stand by your side. And lastly, it revolves around you standing up for yourself and others, and continuously trying to learn more about the world. If we do not examine our own thoughts and the process of deconstructing our beliefs, we risk cornering ourselves. A corner where we feel like we must do whatever other people, the broader society, or the algorithms that are controlled often by the most privileged individuals wanting to divide us want us to do. If you look at people who are yearning for these approvals, they're never content with their own identity. They struggle because they don't understand themselves and they were told to not. They don't understand why they're being hated on because they never took the work to try to understand themselves and gain back the agency they lost. To be strong enough to look through the facade of the leopard, obviously you have to be strong enough to look at the mirror image of yourself first. I wish I had some funny quips or a motivational speech at the end to make everything better, but the truth is, we live in a society where everything is increasingly divided, and our sense of survival has been incredibly on the line. We will probably still see much of the violence, and it is easy to feel frustrated, defeated, and kind of desperate when survival being the problem is back on the map. I started working on the script almost a year ago at this point, and since then, the world not only did not get better, but it is deteriorating at a rate which, quite frankly, none really expected, let alone be emotionally prepared. I struggled in writing the script because sometimes it feels like, what is the point? The issue is by far not the most urgent, nor is it the most interesting to tell. I also doubt that anyone seriously disagree with me will make it this far into a 40-minute video and maybe change their mind. But I also feel like somewhere in the middle of this, there is a message that is important. In a way, as the global billionaires further pushes people's livelihoods to be worse, the authoritarian figures breaking out wars everywhere and put everyone's life on the risk, and the technocrats increasingly using technologies as means of surveillance, we are all underpowered and underprivileged compared to them. It is important to recognize that for most part, especially on the internet, we're not fighting against people who are oppressing us directly, rather than the people who are also hurt and confused. This is not to justify their hatred or actions that do cause tangible harms to people, but it is important to recognize the reasons for their behavior and how to fight against the underlying currents. It maybe also offers a chance of introspection and sees if our own anger or hatred has lost us the plot as well. We're not designed to agree on everything, even as people who are fighting for the same goals, wanting to protect themselves as the world descends into madness and making it out alive. We are all complex people with different experiences and bound to have different understandings and priorities that exist in the world. However, that does not mean that we can never reconcile our differences and that we must give up some of our identities and throw others in our communities under the bus to satisfy the needs of the greedy leopards, however tempting it is. Because the leopards never see you as a friend, it just wants to eat you alive. It will suddenly jump on you, especially when without others willing to cover for you. Hi, thanks for watching to the end. This is post-production not speaking. Um, Unfortunately, I have a little bit of sore throat, so I can't speak much, but thanks for watching. I haven't been making video for almost a year, and I am glad that I'm kind of back. I'm glad that I now have the free time to actually take time to write stuff and record stuff and also edit videos and so on. Hopefully soon I'll also be starting streaming, so please be watch out for the channel. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. There are also some previous video that you can see in this channel, and if you'd like to watch them, please go give them to a look as well. It would be very much appreciated. Hopefully soon I'll be able to bring you more videos and also streaming and so on.